Hey guys, welcome back. It is a Sunday morning and Alfi and I decided to have a little bit of a chat instead of inviting a guest on the show. So we received a design creative related question from someone in the audience and we decided to have a whole conversation about it, as one does. So today we're going to be chatting about the banking sector and the banking space or the finance space and what it's like being a creative in that space. And I think the question we received from the audience member, it was actually quite funny because both myself and Alfi, that's how we met. We were both designers within the ABSA mobile banking team. And Alfi, how long were you there for?
Almost 3 years. It was about like 2 years. Give some change of months.
Okay. Yeah. And I think I was there for about a year and a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was an interesting journey. But and actually maybe that's an interesting place to kind of like start before we get a little bit into like the details of the question. Mm-hmm. Overall, and I guess this is probably going to be a difficult question to answer, but what was your like overall impression of being a creative in the design space? And maybe like an interesting way to go about it is like one thing that you expected to see that you didn't see, and a thing that you something that you didn't expect that you actually experienced.
Okay.
Maybe give it some thought, and I'll go first because I've got one that actually shocked me quite a little bit. I expected a lot more of the kind of like TV version of what banks are, like, you know, a lot of people talking about markets and sort of like trends and kind of like people in suits doing the thing, but in actual fact it sort of just seems like a tiny community of people that are in this like specific sphere of the world, which is people's money. But it's like really, really, really normal people being really normal. Now, I mean, there's obviously like the details and complications of actually, you know, working a job and being a professional. But I think it was just a lot more tame than I expected in some sense.
That's interesting. You mentioned it. I think, you know, there was actually so many things that surprised me in such a good way as well. I think I'm also almost shameful to admit that I didn't expect to work with such good designers. I don't know why I thought, because I think, you know, we have this assumption that all the great experts in our field would rather go work somewhere with a lot more adrenaline, somewhere more exciting than a bank. And that was not the case. I was really surprised with the amazing designers I came across.
That's true.
I mean, that's why you and I have this podcast, because I was just so amazed, you know, by you as well and how well we work together. And some of the amazing design leaders, the people there are just insanely talented. And it almost slapped me in the face. It was such a shock because I did not expect that from a whole design journey. If I look at some of my biggest mentors and role models as not just designers from a technical ability, but also designers from their soft skills, it would be people I reference from my time at the ABSA mobile banking team, which is, was a
you're
big
definitely
surprise.
right. And with the knowledge of not getting too sort of off track, I think I just have to reciprocate on that, because I think one of the things that ABSA definitely stood out in, and I don't know if this is something necessarily about banks or if this is something specific about ABSA, but I think the quality of leaders that I experienced was, I think, one of the highest caliber that I've experienced in any community anywhere. I'd even say, like, in other aspects of life that I've kind of experienced up until now. Like they really stood out. And I think one of the things specifically that stood out was their specific focus on like developing people. Like,
Yeah.
and I mean this maybe a little bit less from the perspective of the bank, but the perspective of the leaders that I sort of engaged with. Because I mean, it might have been different in different areas of the bank, but the leaders at every different level in some sense just seemed to be really good at what they did, but at the same time also really care about the people that they're working with, which in some sense creates like a culture and then also like a level of performance that's captivating. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you.
I was just gonna say maybe what we can do before we get too far off track is chat a little bit about what the question was, because I think it might be interesting to maybe start by dissecting that a little bit.
Okay, cool. So a few weeks ago, I attended a Ladies in UX Cape Town event, and I met quite a few interesting ladies that are either already in the UX space or they're trying to break into the industry. And she actually didn't mention to me whether this question should be anonymous or not. So I'm assuming it shouldn't be. So the question we're going to be reading today and discussing is a question from Renata van Rooyen. And she's a graduate from Stellenbosch University, and she studied financial development, which I found so interesting when I chatted to her, and how she's, trying to pivot and learn a little bit more about what she can do with that knowledge and space from a degree perspective and apply it to UX. And I guess that's why she wrote this question. So her question says, although large conglomerate banks have the resources to stay on top of the fintech game, the execution and delivery and time of innovative projects and products are designed very slowly for the fast-paced financial market. Smaller financial tech startups are exploding and providing consumers with relevant and tailored personalized financial products. An increasing number of customers are becoming unsatisfied with their interest returns and more educated on how these things work, such as the crypto market. So what's the actual question? The question is, how can large banks remain competitive within the financial services industry to deliver new products faster to consumers?
Yeah. That's a $1 million question. Because like any bank that answers this essentially takes the lead for the next few years.
Yeah.
And I think it's an interesting question, and maybe we can first look at some of the core points that she picked out. So the first thing I think that sort of stuck out to me was in the description of the landscape about the larger banks being on top of the fintech game, but essentially like the smaller ones being fast enough to pivot and focus on specific niches.
Yeah.
And it's sort of something that I was thinking about yesterday, is like, if you think about a specific competitive landscape as a part of the community that it exists in. So we'll say banking, for example, like there's a specific need in a community, and that specific competitive landscape is resolving that need. And let's say a simple example is just lending. There are a bunch of different companies that all do lending, and that's a thing that the community needs. But I think as technology develops, the approach to solving that problem essentially also develops, because you've got new technology that enable different kinds of things that weren't previously available. And so I think when banks first started, it was such a big problem, because the real problem was about like how to actually do transactions, and paper notes and all of that got introduced, and the entire banking system. But And so you needed a large organization because it had to have the branches in all of the different areas so that people could actually, go in and exchange their money. But now, as sort of the age of digital banking has been introduced and is starting to penetrate all of these markets, what is required from a resource perspective is much less to actually be able to enable a transaction. Something like PayPal wasn't conceivable a number of years ago.
Yeah.
But now that things like that are enabled, smaller companies are able to be introduced that can actually focus on a specific niche and create a specialized solution. And I almost think it's a necessary evolution, because in some sense, when a company is really big, it becomes inefficient. And I think that's in some sense almost the nature of the business. And so I think her question really encapsulates that step in the process where you transform from big businesses trying to solve all of the big problems to having many small businesses focusing on smaller aspects of a problem.
And I think
I guess that
I think you've already also given a bit of a definition or description of these small fintechs that she refers to in her question, which are the companies that are competing with our big legacy banks. And just to expand on that, so when she refers to, these smaller fintechs, she's referring to what we know as challenger banks or neobanks. And I think it might be useful to just mention a few within the South African space, just so everyone has a better idea. So we have, I think the two most popular ones is probably Time Bank and Discovery Bank, which have been around a little bit longer. And then we also have Bank Zero, which is a little bit I think it's the more newer one on the market. I think we spoke about Bank Zero at APSA for a while as well while they were building it. What I did find interesting about Bank Zero is that they leveraged a lot of very large, reputable companies' technologies in order to build themselves up. So, for instance, their security is all run and provided by IBM. So I think that's quite an advantage they have. It's not all self-built, self-made within their company.
It's actually funny because I guess my entrepreneurial side has a little bit of a bias on that topic, because I always feel like, in some sense, that's one of the things that some of the challenger banks are doing wrong. Is that they're trying to buy their technology, and in some sense, I get it, because it's like, you don't want to reinvent the wheel, which is fair. But when you're innovating, you have to reinvent the part of the wheel that is your area of specialty. And so, in some sense, maybe you can outsource your security, because that's not necessarily your area of expertise. But one of the things I've picked up, and I won't necessarily mention names, but some of the challenger banks essentially have just used like an out-of-the-box type of banking system. So there's a company called Backbase that essentially provides like the internal engine of how a bank works. And in some sense, I get it, because it's good to get to market as fast as possible. But the challenge is that when you're leveraging new technology, you actually need to leverage new technology. You can't use an existing out-of-the-box thing if you're trying to leverage new technology. So I guess my thought on the whole challenger bank thing is, it's good to use what's established and works well. But in some sense, to give yourself a competitive advantage, you have to do something better than everybody else.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
Another thing I thought about when I read Renata's question was sometimes we mistake that competition is a bad thing. You know, there's all these new players, and you see this in every industry, and it goes in cycles and waves. That you get these bunch of new newbies in the space coming, and then dominating the space a little bit, almost taking it over, and then sometimes it levels out. Sometimes, but I do want to mention that, especially in this industry and space, competition is so good. It is so important, because for so long, we as the consumers only had a very few banks or resources that we could go to for, as our financial institution, go to for advice, go to find products that we needed within our lives. And what that competition has now done is quite amazing. If you look around, that, you know, every time there's a new small challenger bank opening up, or one of these new banks or start a new product, everyone's quite curious about what this product is, because everyone's speaking about it. It's in the media. And that kind of forces us to become a little bit more educated around the financial jargon, the financial, how certain financial products work. You know, how does interest work? How does capitalized interest work? All these terms and products. To understand and take up a new product from a challenger bank, you're actually forcing yourself to get a little bit educated, which is the one thing that kind of excites me. Because that's one thing that's so needed.
And I think you're definitely right. And in some sense, I think another advantage is of challenger banks, but generally startups, in a landscape that's sort of being innovated, is they almost, because they usually focus on a niche area rather than replicating everything that the competitor does. They almost demystify that specific niche, because they're so focused and their message is focused on a specific area. They essentially push the boundaries of the status quo in that specific aspect, and they communicate that to the audience or the community. And so in that way also they help essentially boost the rate of education. So I mean, a great example of that, I don't know if you're familiar with Pineapple, the company that does like insurance, like it's a mobile app, and you can just download the app and insure devices and stuff.
I think you've told me about it before. Yeah.
So it's pretty cool, because it's a company that essentially has forced people to rethink how insurance works. Yes. It doesn't have to be the typical experience of being called by someone and then having like your quotes compared and that whole typical journey. They've essentially
getting a broker.
They've almost like shed as much of all the technology that's unnecessary, and used as much of the new technology that they possibly could, which essentially is like the whole mobile app situation. And that's their main point of entry. Like, you could literally get insured completely online without speaking to a person or going to the company at all. And I think when something like that happens, it also lets the community or the customer base actually learn, like, compared to what the existing, the old guard insurance companies are providing me, what is actually necessary, and what are they do, and what is being sort of done simply because of the legacy technology that they have. And I feel like startups essentially always make bigger companies ask that question to themselves.
Exactly.
And so they almost foster innovation simply by competing. Yes.
Oh, I absolutely love that last point you said about they foster innovation by the act of competing, and I think that's so true. I mean, if we look at some of the more traditional legacy banks and how they have changed the past 4 years because of these new players in the industry, it's amazing, and it's good. Because now it gives us as the consumer a little bit more choice and variety, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll decide to go to a challenger bank, but it might just mean that now you actually start to question what is the best product and the best bank for me. Because now you don't just have one choice that's very universal, very copy paste across different banks, which used to be the case. Now you can actually make a little bit more of a informed and personal choice, which is great.
Yeah. No, something that you said actually just reminded me of something that happens all the time at banks. Is when you're saying like they've sort of like these copy paste type of solutions. It's always like when you only have 5 or 6 competitors in the whole country for your whole market. It's kind of like you only compare yourself against those 5 people. And I could always remember, like, you know, you're talking about a project and it's like somebody's like, okay, so I've got this great new idea. And then you look behind it and it's like, oh, FNB just released a new thing, or Nedbank just released a new thing. And this person is trying to recreate that. But then when you've got like a landscape of many different companies taking different approaches to a problem, it's like when that same person goes and try to copy paste an idea, because there are so many ideas, in some sense it can still be, I wouldn't say original, but at least differentiating. So it's just funny how when there are few competitors, they try to just copy each other.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's as far as they can see.
And I actually want to, while we're touching on that topic, I want to speak to actually now answering a little bit Renata's question just on that point that you were saying. You know, I think, or I believe that one way, if you are creative, working within this financial sector space and you are working for one of the more larger banks, how you can be more innovative and compete is exactly like what Alfie mentioned, is to not constantly look over your shoulder, like almost like you're running a race, right? You're on the racetrack and you keep looking back to who's about to overlap and take you and win the race. And we fall in that trap, or a lot of companies and organizations, especially when they've been around for long, they're quite scared of newness. Then we tend to look who's behind us, who's second place, who's third place, fourth place, who's like going to win the race. And that's quite a trap. And what Alfie also mentioned is, so how do we then innovate instead of doing that? So him and I were actually discussing this before as well, around, you know, there's a lot of good things that the big banks have that the challenger banks don't, that they can use to their advantage. So for one is, and Alfie can expand on this a little bit, because I know this, he mentioned this to me, which was banks, our legacy banks have scale, which means they have a lot more resources and capital. So I think as a large bank to look at what is your competitor edge, what do you have that the newer, smaller challenger banks don't have, and then really focusing on honing in on that space and innovating in that space. Because if you innovate within that space, the characteristic or the niche and the thing that your smaller, newer competitors don't have, then you launch new products or features within that space. It's almost impossible for them to very quickly catch up to that new feature or product that you are giving to consumers, because you innovated within the space that you already have competitor edge over them.
No, I think you're absolutely right about that. And in some sense, I almost want to try and bring that idea even more, in some sense, even more concrete to the people who are specifically creatives in that type of a situation, because I think one of the things that needs to happen in the space, if you find yourself as a creative in the large banking space, is that there has to be someone who really understands the business of banking, because you need to be able to differentiate between the places where you have a competitive advantage because of the current situation and the places where you have a competitive advantage from legacy implications. So an example of something like that might be, you know, overseas transactions. That's a place that sooner or later, pretty much anyone who can create an app will be able to do something like that, because it's a technology that currently doesn't require scale anymore. There was a point in which you had to have scale to be able to do that, because you needed to have one person, like a person in one country and a person in another country, in the other country. But that's no longer the case. And so that is one example of a place where innovation in some sense would be more difficult, because there's more competitors, because more people can enable overseas
the
transactions,
entry
and
point
especially with
to
cryptocurrency.
innovation.
Yeah, exactly. With cryptocurrency, the bar is even lower. Literally, like a single developer can enable something like that if they've got enough knowledge. And so, for that reason, as a creative person, what we need to start doing is looking a little bit more about how the actual banking machine works, and look at the places where scale gives you, like I think in business they sometimes call it a moat. It's essentially like an area of value that's protected by something about your business. And as the designers and as the creatives, we need to really look at our customers' problems, but also look for the specific problems that are geared towards scale. Something like home loans. It doesn't matter what enabling technology you have, if you don't have the capital to give somebody like the upfront
millions.
funding of a home loan. Exactly. And so that's one place where the legacy banks can really focus in and hone on developing a new solution that's extremely customer centric, to the degree that some of these really good tech startups are, but focused in an area where the typical startup actually can't compete. And I think that to me is the way that the legacy banks can really stay competitive in a landscape where a lot of new startups are coming up.
Yeah. And I also want to mention for the creatives that are listening, that are either considering stepping into the banking sector or thought about it but think it's a bad idea. And while we're on the topic, there's a large myth around, or stereotype around, designers going into the banking space and, selling yourself to the bank, the big corporates, because it's easier. And we also have this stereotype that there's not a lot of innovation required from a designer or creative working in this space. You don't have that much responsibility to innovate. And I want to say that that's true and that's false. It's true if you, it is what you make of it. So obviously it's a big organization and there's a lot that needs to be done. And as a creative resource, just like in any other company, you have to not just step through an open door, but you actually have to find the doors that you want to open. And that's very true if you're going to be working in the space as well. And myself and Alfie is living proof of that. When we worked on the mobile banking app team, a large part of my year and a little bit there was on amazing concept work. And we did a lot of future vision, very edgy, what do you call it? Idea breaking, conceptual work. You need to go and find it. You need to find the opportunities, present it to your leaders, take ownership of those ideas to be the innovator in that space. Otherwise, yes, it will just be a big, boring organization to you.
I think you're really right. And I think especially for a person who hasn't worked in a small company, I think it's an easy trap to fall into just sort of like doing, in some sense, almost like minimal necessary, and then feeling like essentially your soul is getting crushed. Because I think the thing that's different about a big company versus a smaller company or a startup is that in a big company, what is expected from you from a day-to-day is less. Like just simply the sheer quantity of work that you need to do. And that's because there's a lot more people and there's a lot more that's been ingrained into the system. Like there's been a lot more that's been turned into processes rather than like an individual person needing to be in charge of that.
Yeah.
And so if you've never, in some sense, had to guide your own efforts, it can be, it's easy to fall into that trap if you join a big company. But I think if you've either had the opportunity to work in a smaller team or a smaller like kind of group where essentially in some sense almost everybody has to do everything, I think it's a little bit easier to step into the corporate space and not fall into the kind of like slower cycle. And I think if you actually do manage to do that, if you do manage to move into a corporate space, even if there are some people who tell you that it's super slow, it's boring, and and all of that, like in some sense, you need to look at the person that's saying that and look at their situation and figure out, is the problem the situation or is the problem the person's approach to the situation?
Yeah.
Because I mean, there were a lot of people in the same team as me who didn't feel the way I did. There were people in different departments, people in the same department but on different teams that liked it and others that didn't. And so I think one of the things that I think doesn't get highlighted enough is the fact that there are good jobs and bad jobs out there, but it's also about what you make it.
Yeah.
And especially in a corporate, I think that's the case because it's easy to fall into the into kind of like the more relaxed, slow way to things. Yeah.
Look at me. You're like, there's more slower things. I'm like the rut.
I think a rut actually is a good way to describe it because I think that's how they come about.
I do also want to say, if you're going to be a creative in that space, it is very tempting to also constantly look what competitors are doing, like these new challenger banks, and then, you just want to jump on the bandwagon and also design some crypto embedded platform in your legacy bank system somehow. And I want to say and encourage you to not do that, but to, like Alfie mentioned, there's certain advantages the big banks have, and unfortunately, if you're going to be designing or be a creative in the space, a problem solver in the space, you need to do the homework of actually understanding the banking ecosystem. And that is hard work because banking is hard. And to understand how it works and some of the intricacies, for instance, like the legal and compliance stuff behind some of the products as well. Because as soon as you also understand those things, it's going to be easier for you to innovate within that space rather than to constantly just copy and paste what competitors are doing. And on that point, one thing I think that you can look at if you are in the big bank, one thing that the legacy banks still have over the newer challenger banks is they trust. And we have so much more trust in the legacy big financial institutions than we do in these new banks. And also understanding why that trust is still there and how you can use it and how you shouldn't misuse it. So if I think about like two main things, I would say is why I trust my bank institution that I use, which is they've been around very long and there's still something to say, especially in, I think, our culture in South Africa. We still really value like wisdom and knowledge that has been carried down through centuries. We value old, and we know something that has aged, like a good wine, has good value. And then the second thing, go ahead, Alfie.
I was just going to say, especially in a landscape where security is such an important thing.
Yes.
I think there especially is where trust and kind of like the fact that they've been around plays such a big role.
Yeah, exactly. Then the other thing is, which is kind of why we hate working in a large bank sometimes, which is because we feel like things happen very slowly, which is true. They do happen very slowly. And change in something that is so massive happens slowly because so many small things need to move for something that's big to move. And I think as a designer, sometimes we really wish that would happen faster, and we want to force it to happen faster, but also changing your perspective to look at that is partially also contributing to consumers' trust, because something that doesn't change easily or something that doesn't change quickly is more consistent. And those seem to be characteristics that we also then see as more trustworthy. So
Yeah.
maybe as a creative, just understanding where and how that trust is embedded in customers so that you also don't disrupt that and break the one large competitor edge that these banks have.
Yeah. No, I think you're definitely right, and I think it's a mental shift that's quite difficult for designers, and I say that because it was difficult for me.
Yeah.
Going into a space where sometimes the right choice is not to change the thing, and that's a good reason to not do a thing. And the thing is, it's a tightrope to walk, because it can very easily become an excuse for people to avoid doing things.
Yeah.
Like, it's a very easy way to just continue doing things wrong because it's the way you've always done it, and so it's how you have to keep doing it. Because there are cases where that is a very true argument. You don't, for example, like, I don't want to open my banking app one day and suddenly I can't see my balance. Like, that's, even though you could make whatever design justification you want for that, but changing something that's that vital to my experience of the app essentially shakes that trust. And so, in some sense, as a designer, your the landscape in which you're thinking has to drastically increase. But then also, like, your approach to changing things, I think, also needs to change in some sense, because it needs to be more gradual rather than, rip the band-aid off types of changes,
Yeah.
which can get old, and I guess maybe explains the reason I'm not in banking anymore. But the thing is, I realize that that's as a result of an aspect of my personality, because I think there are some people who thrive in a situation that's gradually changing rather than drastically.
Yeah.
And I
And
know
also
about
where,
myself that I appreciate drastic change.
also an environment where innovation is possible, but it's so much harder. Like moving the needle is harder, and some people thrive off of that because you can be an innovator, and that means coming up with 20 ideas is easy. And if you're in a smaller company, maybe 19 of those 20 ideas are more susceptible, which is makes it easier to also be innovative. But if you're someone who's creative, likes problem solving, but also likes the challenge of, really being pushed about how many ideas and ways you can innovate, I think then banking is probably a good space for you to play in, a nice playground, because it is hard to innovate
Yeah.
in that space, but that's part of the attraction to it.
Yeah. And look, I'd also say another thing, and maybe this is taking a little bit of a different angle on the conversation about why the financial services companies are really important for the design space, I think, is because they almost create a platform for industry people to develop. In some sense, I think banks are a good place to hone a skill. Like, if there's a
Yeah.
specific thing that you either want to learn how to do or already do and want to become like really specialized in, I think the banks are a good place to do that. Obviously, if the bank needs that specific skill or service. But I think because in some sense they're slower, you get to take your time. You get to, like, really, really get into the details of things. And I
Yeah.
think for me at least, especially in my experience, for me at the bank, that was design systems. Like, in some sense, because the project work wasn't like that of a startup, being like a headless chicken pretty much every day. You can take
Being
the
thrown
time
into
to
the
do
deep end every day.
exactly. You can take the time to kind of like really get into the minutia of things and kind of like address the things that maybe might not necessarily be a direct advantage to the business, but in some sense either further the field or further your knowledge of the field. And so I think that's something that's valuable that I think the banks provide, that people like creatives and designers should really think about, especially I'd say in the like early to mid stages of their career. I think the banks are a good place.
Yeah, 100%. I have one last thing I thought about to answer Renata's question around, how can these big legacy banks be more innovative to compete? And one thing came to mind as well, which is legacy banks, like you mentioned, Alfie, have more capital because they're older, they're bigger, they have scale as their advantage, which also means there's more resources for your disposal. And that, what I mean by that is two things. The one is they can afford better people to develop products and teams and services, which is great. And that's a big advantage. And that is probably why when we were at the mobile app team, we were surrounded by brilliant people because they were able to afford those people. Because I can't see a single one of those people going to a very smaller, downscaled salary. And that's the facts. That's the hard facts right there. They can afford good people. Then the other thing, when I say they have resource to their advantage, is the large legacy banks still dominate within the industry when it comes to customer numbers. And now we've already spoken about the element of trust they have that's been built over so many years. So one thing as a creative in that space is to leverage the customer numbers and trust, is to really push to be speaking to customers more. So Alfie and I were fortunate enough to do quite a bit of user testing and interviews. And I think that's one thing, and I'm just making an assumption here because I actually haven't done work for any challenger banks, but I'm making the assumption that it's actually easier to speak to a large amount of people when you're working for a legacy bank because they have those numbers of customers, and the customers have a good relationship in terms of trust with this institution to actually want to give feedback and want to speak, which I think is a factor we overlook because we all know, speaking to customers is so important. Customer feedback is everything. And maybe that's something that's not being utilized enough in these spaces. And maybe that's something the new challenger banks struggle with, that if you are creative in the space of a large scale legacy bank, focus on that.
Yeah, no, I think you're definitely right, because it's also a much easier problem for them to solve because, I mean, you've got more customers, so there are more people to recruit.
Exactly.
The bigger banks can have the recruitment agencies. They can have people whose focus it is specifically to find the people that you need to speak to. While at a startup, that's like
your job.
That's somebody's side job is recruitment. And so I think you're definitely right there. But I think the thing that I just want to touch on maybe before we sort of take things to a close was the aspect about resources that you mentioned, because I think in some sense the advantages that the larger corporations, and this is not necessarily just banks, have is they do have access to the very talented people, which is amazing. But their challenge is actually being able to realize the potential of those people. And I think that's the place where they really fall short. I think startups do a much better job of utilizing the resources that they do have because they're very limited, and they have to stretch them as far as they possibly can. But I do think that I do think a lot of banks could probably even double their output by improving their ways of work and improving their actual essential like utilization of the resources that they have at hand. And granted, it is a much more complicated thing to do when you are in a big company versus a small company, but in some sense I think it's a valuable thing to do, because for two reasons. Like, the first is you already have the people. You may as well use them. In some sense, really, the only cost to increase your output is finding out how to actually improve that specific way of work. And so I do think in a lot of companies, a fair amount more money should go into development rather than necessarily just hiring. Because I think once you hiring the person, in some sense, is only step one on a journey to getting them to being like an actual valuable and productive member of the team. And so I think that's something that a lot of teams should invest significantly more into. Because I also think when a person is used to their full potential, they also enjoy their work more, because you feel like you're getting challenged. You feel like you're getting the support that you need. And so in some sense, not only does each individual person perform, like, output more, they're also happier in some sense. So I think that's my final thought on how the large banks can remain competitive.
All right. Well, I hope, Renata, we have answered your question, and thank you for everyone for listening to our unqualified and unsolicited advice and opinions. Maybe it's helpful. Maybe it's just amusing.
Definitely. I think it was also great to kind of like take a little different approach to this podcast today. I quite enjoyed the conversation, and we'd love to hear back from anybody who's gone into this far into the conversation. Please leave us a comment, send us a message directly, send us an email, whatever really suits you, and tell us a little bit about how you felt about the conversation. And I guess with no further ado, we will end it there. Thanks everyone for listening, and goodbye.